Hello there, fellow seekers of hidden truths. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope your day has been treating you well, whether it's morning coffee where you are, an afternoon break, or you're settling in for the evening like so many of our listeners around the globe, from Tokyo to London, Sao Paulo to Sydney. Welcome to Sleep Theories. If this is your first time joining us, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows that powerful people prefer to keep hidden. And now, let's descend into the redwoods of Northern California, where ancient trees witness modern horrors. Recovered journal entry, classification redacted. Subject: Eli Granger, independent journalist. Date range: July 15th to 18th, 2023. Location: Bohemian Grove, Monte Rio, California. The following document was recovered from an encrypted server farm in Iceland. The journalist's current whereabouts remain unknown. Ed. My name is Eli Granger, and I'm writing this because I may not live long enough to tell it in person. What I witnessed in the redwoods of Northern California will haunt me until my dying day, whenever that may come. It started 3 weeks ago with an email that shouldn't have existed. I was in my cramped Oakland apartment, nursing my third cup of coffee, and scrolling through encrypted channels where whistleblowers sometimes surface. My secure inbox pinged. A message from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters, routed through 7 different proxy servers. No subject line, just an attachment and 4 lines of text. You want truth? Go to the redwoods. Bring a black suit and a quiet soul. July 15th to 18th. The fire reveals all. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of what appeared to be a guest registry for the Bohemian Grove, that mysterious all-male retreat where the world's most powerful men allegedly gather each summer to commune with nature. I'd written about the Grove before, relying on second-hand accounts and leaked photographs from the 1980s, but this was different. The names on the list made my blood run cold. Former presidents, current senators, military contractors whose companies I'd been investigating for years, CEOs of tech giants, pharmaceutical corporations, defense contractors, media moguls who controlled the narrative of entire nations, all scheduled to attend something called the Midsummer Encampment. At the bottom of the scan was a forged access pass with my photograph, a professional headshot I'd never sent to anyone, digitally altered to show me in a black suit and tie. The name read Edmund Gray, Logistics Consultant, Prometheus Industries. Someone with serious resources wanted me inside that grove. The question was why? I should have walked away. Should have deleted the email and gone back to writing about municipal corruption and corporate tax avoidance. Safe stories. Stories that didn't get journalists killed. Instead, I packed a black suit and drove north to Sonoma County. The road to Monte Rio winds through some of the most beautiful country in California. Ancient redwoods tower over narrow highways, their canopy so thick that midday feels like twilight. It's the kind of place where you'd expect to find hippie communes and organic wineries, not shadowy cabals plotting the fate of nations. But as I learned in my Navy intelligence days, the most dangerous secrets are always hidden in the most innocent places. I parked at a motel in Gurneville and walked the perimeter of the Bohemian Grove property that evening. 2,000 acres of private forest, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras every 50 feet, motion sensors in the trees, the kind of setup you'd expect around a military installation, not a summer camp for rich men. The main gate was staffed by guards who looked more like special forces operators than private security. Black uniforms, tactical gear, the flat stare of men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Whatever happened inside those redwoods, they were serious about keeping it secret. The forged pass worked perfectly, too perfectly. The guards scanned the barcode, checked my face against the photo, and waved me through without a second glance. Either the forger was a genius, or someone very powerful wanted me inside. Neither possibility was comforting. The grove itself was exactly as described in the leaked accounts I'd read. Massive redwood trees, some over 1,000 years old, stretched toward a canopy so thick it blocked out the sun. Gravel paths wound between rustic cabins and open-air lodges, each marked with whimsical names: Owl's Nest, Dragon's Den, Caveman's Lodge. It would have been charming if not for the underlying sense of wrongness that permeated everything. The other guests, I couldn't think of them as normal people, not after seeing that registry, moved through this camp with the easy confidence of men accustomed to absolute power. They wore casual clothes during the day, khakis, polo shirts, boat shoes, the uniform of American aristocracy. But their conversations, caught in fragments as I passed, revealed the true scope of their influence. The Shanghai Index will drop exactly 17%. Tell the secretary that Operation Nightfall is greenlit for October. Media blackout should hold for at least 72 hours. I posed as a logistics consultant, which gave me an excuse to wander the grounds with a clipboard and camera phone, confiscated at the gate and replaced with an approved device that couldn't access external networks. The cover story worked well enough. Rich men are accustomed to being served by invisible people who handle the mundane details of their lives. But as the day wore on, I began to notice the symbols. Owls everywhere. Carved into tree trunks, etched on building facades, worked into the designs of benches and lampposts. Not cute, friendly owls. These were stylized, angular, with eyes that seemed to follow you as you walked past. The largest was a 40-foot stone statue positioned on a small island in an artificial lake at the heart of the grove. Even in daylight, it radiated a sense of ancient malevolence. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find a man in his 70s watching me stare at the giant owl. Silver hair, expensive casual wear, the kind of artificial tan that comes from winters in Palm Beach. His eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost colourless. The owl of Bohemia, he continued, joining me at the lake's edge. Been watching over this place for over a century. Some say it's just decorative, others know better. Know better how? I asked, immediately regretting the question. I was supposed to be invisible, unremarkable. The old man smiled, revealing teeth too white and too perfect for his age. You'll see tonight, Mr. Grey. The cremation of care waits for no man, not even consultants. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at the owl statue and wondering how much my cover had already been blown. That evening, as twilight settled over the grove, the atmosphere changed completely. The casual bonhomie of the day disappeared, replaced by something far more serious and ritualistic. Men emerged from their cabins wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces. Some carried torches, others strange ceremonial objects I couldn't identify. I found a dark robe hanging in my assigned cabin, along with a note. Attendance is mandatory. Silence is sacred. The owl sees all. What I witnessed that night will stay with me forever. As darkness fell, hundreds of robed figures processed through the forest paths, converging on the lake where the great owl statue loomed. Torches flickered between the trees like malevolent fireflies. The only sounds were footsteps on gravel and the whisper of fabric against bark. I followed the crowd, keeping my head down and my hood up. The robe smelled of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. We gathered in a natural amphitheatre around the lake. The owl statue dominated the scene, its eyes seeming to glow red in the torchlight. A wooden boat had been prepared at the water's edge, and in it lay what appeared to be the effigy of a child, small, wrapped in white cloth, disturbingly lifelike. But as I stared at the bundle, a horrible doubt crept into my mind. The proportions were too perfect, the weight distribution too natural. The way the cloth clung to what lay beneath suggested something more substantial than straw and sawdust. A figure in an elaborate robe stepped onto a platform beside the owl. Even with his face hidden, I recognised the bearing and voice of a man who'd been on television every night for years. A former president whose policies had shaped a generation. Brothers of the Grove, his voice boomed across the water, amplified by hidden speakers. We gather once again beneath the ancient eyes of wisdom to perform the sacred rite that frees us from the burdens of conscience. The crowd responded in unison. We banish care and cast it to the flames. Care, that pale and common thing that binds the hands of power. Care that whispers doubt in the ears of decision. care that stays the sword of necessary action. We banish care and cast it to the flames. The ritualized call and response continued for nearly an hour. Invocations to ancient deities whose names I recognized from my study of Middle Eastern mythology. Moloch, the Carthaginian god of child sacrifice. Enlil, the Mesopotamian lord of wind and authority. Names that shouldn't have been spoken by American leaders in the 21st century. But the most disturbing element wasn't the pagan imagery, or even the suggestions of child sacrifice. It was the casual way these men, titans of industry, shapers of policy, guardians of democracy, participated in rituals that explicitly celebrated the abandonment of human compassion. The ceremony reached its climax when the boat carrying the effigy was pushed out onto the lake. Flames erupted from the water around it, hidden gas jets, I realised, creating the illusion of supernatural fire. The figure in the boat burned quickly, the white cloth falling away to reveal... I still can't be certain what I saw. In the flickering light, with smoke obscuring my vision and my mind reeling from the horror of it all, it might have been an elaborately constructed mannequin. The realistic movement could have been caused by the flames consuming internal supports. The sounds, brief, high-pitched, quickly cut off, might have been air escaping from burning materials. But the way some of the robed figures wept as the fire consumed its offering, the way others cheered with genuine ecstasy, suggested something far more sinister than theatrical pageantry. As the flames died down, the crowd began to disperse. I started to follow them back toward the cabins, but a hand fell on my shoulder. Mr. Grey. It was the old man from earlier, still wearing his ceremonial robes. You're invited to the inner circle gathering. A rare honour for a consultant. Before I could refuse, two other figures flanked me. Not threatening exactly, but their presence made it clear that declining wasn't an option. They led me deeper into the forest, away from the main paths, to a clearing I hadn't seen during my earlier reconnaissance. Here, perhaps 30 men stood in a circle around a fire pit carved directly into the bedrock. Unlike the theatrical grandeur of the main ceremony, this felt ancient and deadly serious. The inner circle ritual began at midnight. The participants had exchanged their dark robes for masks of polished bone, owl faces with hollow eye sockets that seemed to bore into your soul. They moved with practiced precision, suggesting this ceremony had been performed countless times before. The man who'd led the earlier ritual stepped into the centre of the circle. Without his presidential bearing and familiar voice, he seemed diminished, just another acolyte serving powers older than nations. "Brothers of the Inner Grove," he intoned, "we gather to receive the wisdom of the Ancient Ones, and to consecrate the plans that will shape the world's destiny." The response came in a language I didn't recognise at first, harsh consonants and guttural vowels that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something primal and terrified in the human psyche. But as my Navy intelligence training kicked in, I began to parse familiar elements. This was Akkadian, the ancient language of Mesopotamia, dead for over 2,000 years. They were chanting the names of forgotten gods and promising them sacrifices of nations. Symbols were drawn in the ash around the fire pit, not random occult doodles, but specific sigils I recognised from declassified CIA documents. Project MK Ultra had experimented with ritualistic programming, using ancient symbols and dead languages to bypass conscious resistance in human subjects. The research had supposedly been discontinued in the 1970s. Apparently it had just moved to a more exclusive venue. The ceremony continued for hours. Maps were produced and spread on the ground, not of geographical territories, but of economic zones, resource deposits, population centres. Plans were discussed in mixture of English and Akkadian, but the intent was clear enough. Wars to be started, governments to be toppled, populations to be controlled. And through it all, the participants spoke of themselves not as American leaders serving American interests, but as servants of the Ancient Ones, preparing the world for some greater transformation. "The harvest approaches," one masked figure intoned. "The sleepers must be awakened. The old seals must be broken." "In the name of those who wait in the deep places," the circle responded, "let the work continue." I crouched in the shadows beyond the firelight, recording everything on a digital audio device I'd hidden in my shoe. But as the night wore on, I began to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't just corruption or conspiracy in any conventional sense. These men genuinely believed they were serving inhuman masters. Whether those masters were real or imagined didn't matter. The policies they were planning would affect millions of lives based on the whims of entities that viewed humanity as livestock. The ritual concluded with each participant drinking from a silver chalice and making individual pledges. The liquid looked black in the firelight, and several men convulsed briefly after drinking, their eyes rolling back to show only white. As dawn approached, the circle dissolved. The participants removed their masks, revealed themselves to be exactly who I'd suspected. Former presidents, current senators, military leaders, corporate titans. They shook hands and exchanged quiet words like businessmen concluding a profitable meeting, which in a sense they were. I made it back to my cabin as the first light filtered through the redwood canopy, but I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Whatever protection my forged identity provided was wearing thin. Too many meaningful looks, too many knowing smiles. They were playing with me, letting me see just enough to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. But there was one more place I needed to investigate before I could flee. The lodge marked Styx, access by code only, sat apart from the main camp, connected by a service road that didn't appear on any of the maps provided to guests. I'd noticed it during my first day's reconnaissance, but hadn't found an opportunity to investigate. The building itself was unremarkable. Standard wooden construction that matched the other lodges, designed to blend into the forest environment. But the security was anything but standard. Biometric scanners, electromagnetic locks, motion sensors that could detect a heartbeat from 50 feet away. Fortunately, my anonymous benefactor had provided more than just a forged access pass. Hidden in the lining of my suit jacket was a USB device that looked like a standard thumb drive, but contained sophisticated hacking tools developed by someone with serious technical skills. When plugged into the lodge's security system, it created a temporary blind spot in the sensors and provided the access codes needed to bypass the locks. Whoever wanted me to see what lay inside had planned this infiltration down to the smallest detail. The lodge's interior was a facade. Behind a false wall accessed by yet another hidden panel, stairs led down into the bedrock beneath the forest. The passage was older than the buildings above, carved stone rather than modern construction, lit by electric fixtures that had been retrofitted into ancient sconces. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy oak door opened onto a chamber that took my breath away. The room stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the lodge's footprint above. Stone shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound journals, rolled documents, and artefacts that seemed to span centuries. At the centre of the chamber stood a massive table carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface covered with maps, blueprints, and what appeared to be governmental documents bearing official seals. I started with the journals, selecting one at random from a shelf marked 1923 to 1945. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, but the contents were anything but quaint. The European situation proceeds according to plan. Our associates in Berlin understand their role, though they believe themselves to be serving the fatherland rather than the ancient ones. The sacrifice of the lesser peoples will provide the spiritual energy necessary for the next phase of the great work. Another journal, this one more recent. Operation Mockingbird exceeds all expectations. The media outlets respond to our guidance without question, believing they serve journalistic integrity, while actually perpetuating the narratives required for population control. The sleeping masses accept whatever reality we provide. But it was the documents on the central table that truly shattered my understanding of how the world worked. Blueprints for the USA Patriot Act dated 6 months before September 11, 2001. Battle plans for the invasion of Iraq, complete with fabricated intelligence reports about weapons of mass destruction. Early drafts of social media algorithms designed not to connect people, but to divide them into manageable, controllable factions. And newer documents that made my blood run cold. Plans for a global pandemic response that prioritized control over public health. Blueprints for digital currency systems that would eliminate financial privacy entirely, population reduction strategies disguised as environmental initiatives. The most disturbing document was a roster of participants going back to the 1870s, when the Bohemian Club was first founded. Names I recognised from history textbooks, titans of the Gilded Age who'd shaped America's industrial development, but also names that shouldn't have been there. Figures from much earlier periods, some dating back centuries. Either the record keeping was fantastically inaccurate, or some of these participants weren't entirely human. At the bottom of the most recent page, a note in fresh handwriting. E. Granger, journalist, witnessed inner circle ceremony. July 16th, 2023. Asset or liability. Recommend termination if no compliance by dawn July 18th. They knew exactly who I was, had known from the moment I'd walked through their gates, the anonymous email, the forged pass, the convenient access codes. It had all been an elaborate test, and I was apparently failing. A motion sensor somewhere in the chamber beeped softly. Red lights began flashing along the walls. In the distance I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stone stairs. I grabbed as many documents as I could carry, stuffed them into my jacket and looked for another way out. But there was only one exit, and it was about to be filled with very unfriendly people. The footsteps were getting closer. Voices echoed down the stairwell. Professional, clipped. The kind of tactical communication used by military operators. But then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in hellish red. And in that brief moment of darkness, I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. A voice speaking directly into my mind, words that bypassed my ears entirely. Run, little journalist. Run and tell the world what you've seen, but know that the telling will be your doom, and the world's salvation requires far greater sacrifices than one man's life. When the emergency light stabilised, a section of the stone wall had opened, revealing a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the earth. I didn't hesitate. Whatever entity had just spoken to me, whether it was one of the ancient ones or something else entirely, it was offering me a chance to escape. I took it. The tunnel system beneath the grove was extensive and clearly ancient. Carved passages connected natural caves, creating a network that probably extended for miles underground. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those I'd seen during the inner circle ceremony, but these were older, deeper, worn smooth by centuries of whatever had moved through these spaces. I followed the main passage for what felt like hours, guided by phosphorescent moss that provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. Behind me, I could hear sounds of pursuit, voices, flashlight beams, the occasional echo of radio communication, but the sounds were growing fainter, suggesting that my pursuers either couldn't find the tunnel entrance or were reluctant to follow me into the deep places beneath the forest. Eventually the passage began to slope upward. Fresh air carried the scent of rain and growing things. A natural opening concealed by hanging vines led out into the forest several miles from the main grove compound. I emerged to find the sky filled with storm clouds. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Perfect cover for an escape, if I could make it to my car before the grove's security forces expanded their search perimeter. But as I made my way through the forest, I realised I wasn't alone. Figures moved between the trees, not the tactical teams I'd expected, but something far stranger. They wore the bone-white owl masks from the inner circle ceremony, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise. And their eyes glowed with a faint bioluminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light. "The journalist sees too much," one of them said, the words somehow audible despite the increasing thunder. "The ancient ones are displeased." "But the compact must be honoured," another replied. "He was brought here for a purpose. Let him carry the message to the outer world. Let them know what awaits." I ran. Behind me, inhuman laughter echoed through the forest. Not pursuit exactly, but something far more unsettling. The sound of predators who were confident their prey could never truly escape. I reached my rental car as the storm broke in earnest. Rain pounded the windshield as I drove through the night, taking back roads and avoiding the main highways. In my jacket pocket, the stolen documents felt like they were burning against my chest. But I'd made it out. I had evidence. I had proof of the conspiracy that shaped world events from the shadows of a California forest. Or so I thought. I uploaded everything to an offshore server farm in Iceland. Documents, audio recordings, photographs, detailed notes of everything I'd witnessed. Multiple backup copies, distributed through anonymous networks, protected by military-grade encryption. Within 6 hours, every file had been corrupted or deleted. My apartment was ransacked while I was at an internet cafe, uploading the files. Nothing obviously stolen, but every electronic device had been confiscated or destroyed. My laptop, phone, backup drives, even the digital camera I'd left in a drawer, all gone. The mainstream media ignored my story completely. Alternative news sites that initially showed interest suddenly went silent. Forum posts about the Grove were deleted within minutes of being posted. It was as if the entire internet had been scrubbed of any reference to what I'd discovered. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night since my escape, I've been visited by visions of the Ancient Ones. Vast, tentacled entities that exist in spaces between dimensions, feeding on human suffering and preparing for some cosmic transformation that will remake reality according to their twisted desires. They show me glimpses of the future they're working to create. Cities drowned beneath black oceans, skies filled with screaming winds, populations reduced to cattle serving inhuman masters. And they whisper that I'm not a hero or a journalist or even a victim. I'm a messenger. They wanted someone to witness their ceremony, to understand the scope of their power, to carry word of their inevitable victory to the outside world. Not to warn humanity. Warnings imply the possibility of resistance, but to spread the despair that will make their final conquest easier. Every word I write, every person I tell, every attempt to expose the truth only serves their greater purpose. The corruption of hope, the murder of faith in human institutions, the slow transformation of free people into willing slaves. I'm writing this final entry from a motel room in Reno. I've been driving for 3 days, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. But I know it doesn't matter. They're not hunting me because they don't need to. I'm already serving their purpose just by existing, just by remembering what I saw in the Grove. The cremation of care wasn't just a ritual, it was a recruitment ceremony. And I wasn't an infiltrator, I was an initiate. Tonight, I'll drive east toward the desert. Maybe I'll find some way to break the cycle, to turn their own trap against them. Or maybe I'll just disappear into the wasteland and let the truth die with me. But if you're reading this, if somehow these words have reached you despite all their efforts to control the flow of information, then remember this. They call it the cremation of care, but what they really burn is conscience. And when the fires die down, the world grows a little colder, a little darker, a little more ready for the Ancient Ones to reclaim what they consider their rightful dominion. The fire in the Grove never really goes out. It just spreads, invisible and inexorable, consuming everything human until only the shadows remain. And in those shadows something very old and very hungry is waiting to be born. Settle in as we explore what might be lurking beneath those peaceful cornfields. The radio transmitter hummed to life with a familiar electric wheeze, its vintage dials glowing amber in the dimness of the shed. Mattie Connors wiped dust from the frequency display, her fingers leaving clean trails across the aged panel. Her father's ancient ham radio equipment had sat untouched for nearly a decade, but tonight, on her 25th birthday, seemed like the perfect time to resurrect it. "Come on, old friend," she whispered, turning the tuning knob delicately. "Let's see if you still work." Outside, beyond the weathered walls of the equipment shed, cornstalks whispered in the summer night. The Connors farm stretched for 40 acres in all directions, a modest plot by Iowa standards, but enough to keep her father in business after her mother passed. Enough to keep Mattie trapped in Granger when her engineering scholarship fell through. Enough empty space to broadcast music that no one would hear. The transmitter's needle jumped, finding power. Static hissed through the speakers. Mattie checked her phone's FM radio app, searching for an empty frequency to experiment with. Most of the dial was dead air this far from Des Moines, just how she wanted it. She settled on 88.1 FM, twisted the broadcast dial to match, and waited. The static changed. Not suddenly, but in such a subtle shift that she almost missed it. The white noise acquired rhythm, a soft, regular thump that reminded her of a heartbeat but mechanical, precise, too regular for anything natural. "That's weird," she muttered, checking connections. The transmitter wasn't actually broadcasting yet. It was receiving. The rhythmic pulse continued, now joined by a faint high-pitched tone that danced above the lower beat. It reminded her of the harmonic pattern generators she'd built during her brief engineering stint at Iowa State. The sound was almost mathematical in its precision. Mattie glanced at her watch. 3:33 a.m. She grabbed her phone and started recording, holding the microphone close to the radio's speaker. After a full minute, the signal abruptly cut off, returning to pure static. Back in her bedroom, Mattie downloaded the audio file and opened her sound editing software. She hadn't used these programs since dropping out of college, but some skills never quite disappeared. She ran the signal through a spectrogram analysis, watching as the visual representation of the sound materialized on her screen. What she saw made her sit back in her chair. The patterns weren't random. The high-pitched overtones, when mapped visually, created distinct numerical sequences, first 7 prime numbers, then what appeared to be the beginning of a Fibonacci sequence. This wasn't terrestrial interference or random cosmic noise. This was structured, intelligent. "What the hell?" she whispered, running the analysis again. By sunrise, Mattie had created 3 different spectrograms and converted portions of the signal into numerical values. She'd spent hours on Reddit forums for audio engineers and amateur astronomers, eventually posting her findings with a simple question. Found weird signal on 88.1 FM in rural Iowa. Any ideas what this could be? She attached the audio file and her preliminary analysis before collapsing into bed, the morning chores temporarily forgotten. Her last conscious thought was that she should check the frequency again the following night. When she woke at noon, her post had been removed, not just downvoted or flagged, completely gone, as if it had never existed. Her browser history showed she'd visited the site, but the post itself had vanished. More disturbing still, the audio file she'd uploaded to her cloud drive was gone too. "Dad," she called, heading downstairs, "did you use my computer this morning?" Walter Connors sat at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. At 63, he maintained the stoic demeanour of someone who had spent a lifetime watching seeds grow into crops, only to be harvested and planted again. Patience lived in the creases around his eyes. "Didn't touch it," he replied, not looking up from his newspaper. "Why?" "Some files went missing," Mattie said, pouring herself coffee. "Weird stuff I recorded last night on your old radio setup." Her father's hand stilled, coffee mug halfway to his lips. What frequency? The question struck her as odd. 88.1. Why? Walter carefully folded his newspaper, a deliberate movement that Mattie recognised as his way of buying time. That old transmitter picks up all kinds of interference, probably just noise from the power lines. Power line noise doesn't transmit prime number sequences, Dad. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the ancient wall clock. Walter cleared his throat. "Sometimes it's better not to broadcast what you hear," he said finally, "especially around here." "What's that supposed to mean?" Mattie pressed. Walter stood, rinsing his mug at the sink. "Just saying some signals aren't meant to be shared." He left for the fields before she could question him further. but his reaction only intensified her curiosity. What did her father know about a random radio frequency? Why would he care if she shared what she'd found? That afternoon, Mattie drove into town, laptop tucked under her arm. The Granger Public Library was small but offered free Wi-Fi that wasn't linked to her home network. She uploaded her recordings again, this time to a more obscure forum dedicated to unexplained radio phenomena. Within an hour she had 3 responses. Definitely artificial. Pattern repeats exactly every 42.7 seconds. Looks like SETI stuff. Where exactly did you record this? Check your DMS. The direct message came from a user named RadioSilence_1977. Take this down immediately. They monitor these forums. 88.1 is part of Node 0. Not your discovery, not the first time. Call the number in your area that ends with 3333 if you need to understand why this matters. Mattie stared at the message, a chill running through her despite the summer heat. She started typing a response when the library's internet connection suddenly dropped. The librarian announced they were experiencing technical difficulties. By the time Mattie returned home, her forum post had vanished too. That evening, as sunset painted the cornfields in golden shadow, Mattie noticed something unusual from her bedroom window. A utility truck parked at the edge of their property. 2 men in matching grey uniforms stood beside it, looking toward the house. Though too distant to see clearly, something about their synchronised movements seemed unnatural, as if they were mirrors of each other. When she blinked, they were gone. The truck, too. Only empty road remained. At exactly 3:33 a.m, Mattie sat in the equipment shed, headphones on, the radio tuned to 88.1 FM. The signal returned, stronger tonight, its pulsing rhythm somehow more urgent. The mathematical sequences had evolved, growing more complex. In the distance, she could have sworn she heard the cornstalks rustling in perfect synchronization with the beat. Mattie woke to the sound of her computer rebooting, the distinctive startup chime jolting her from sleep. The clock on her nightstand read 3:33 a.m. She hadn't set an alarm. Rubbing sleep from her eyes, she watched as her screen flashed to life, opened a blank document, and displayed a single line of text. Not for you to hear. The cursor blinked rhythmically before the computer shut itself down. Mattie sat frozen, heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't touched the keyboard. She hadn't even been near the computer. Morning brought no clarity, only more questions. While checking the fence line after breakfast, she discovered a perfect circle in the cornfield, about 10 feet in diameter, where the stalks lay flat against the ground, spiralling inward toward a centre point. The corn wasn't broken or damaged, just uniformly bent as if pressed down by an invisible hand. "Dad!" she called out, finding Walter inspecting an irrigation pump nearby. "Come look at this." Her father approached slowly, his face unreadable as he surveyed the formation. "Wind damage," he said flatly. "Wind doesn't create perfect circles with mathematical precision," Mattie argued, "and it doesn't just happen to show up after I record that signal." Walter sighed heavily. "Leave it alone, Mattie. Please." "Why won't you tell me what you know about this?" She gestured toward the flattened corn. "This isn't normal, and you're acting like it's just another Tuesday." Her father removed his cap, running a hand through thinning grey hair. "I worked radar systems before I inherited this farm. Air Force, 1985 to 1991, stationed up at the North Dakota border most of that time." This wasn't news to Mattie, but his tone suggested he was building to something important. "There were frequencies we were told never to acknowledge," he continued. "Signals that appeared on our scopes that we logged as equipment malfunction, even when we knew better. The brass called them ambient anomalies. We called them visitors." Mattie stared at him. "Are you saying you detected UFOs?" "I'm saying some things in this world speak in ways we're not meant to understand." And answering back, he paused, looking directly at her. That's when trouble starts. Before she could press further, the distant sound of a vehicle drew their attention. The same utility truck from yesterday approached along the access road, moving unhurriedly. "Go inside," Walter said quietly. "Who are they?" "Don't know, don't want to, just go." Matty retreated to the house, but watched from the kitchen window as her father met the truck at the end of their driveway. Two men emerged, identical in height and build, wearing matching grey uniforms. Even from this distance, their movements seemed eerily coordinated. They spoke briefly with Walter, who nodded several times. One of them handed him what appeared to be a business card. Then they departed, the truck disappearing down the dusty road. Walter returned to the house, his expression troubled. "Electric company," he said, before Matty could ask. "Checking lines. In matching uniforms with synchronized walks? Come on, Dad." He placed the card on the counter. It was blank except for a phone number, one that ended in 3333. "Sometimes," Walter said carefully, "it's better to ask permission than forgiveness." That afternoon, while her father napped, Matty drove to the Granger Historical Society, a glorified storage room attached to the town hall. The elderly volunteer seemed surprised to have a visitor. "Looking for information on any radio stations or transmission towers that might have operated around here," Matty explained, "especially during the Cold War." The woman pursed her lips. "That'd be the old emergency broadcast station, I suppose. Closed down in 97 or thereabouts. Never did much broadcasting that I recall." "Where was it located?" "About 8 miles north of town. Nothing left now but the foundation." With directions in hand, Matty found the site easily enough. A concrete slab obscured by weeds, with the rusted remains of a tower anchor still visible. What caught her attention, however, was what lay beneath. A sealed metal hatch, its surface weathered but intact, emblazoned with faded government markings. She photographed everything, particularly the designation stencilled on the hatch. ARCS Node 0. Back home, Matty began researching ARCS, and found sparse references to the Agricultural Region Communication System, ostensibly created to warn rural communities of nuclear threats. But one declassified document mentioned passive monitoring capabilities and anomalous frequency capture. She expanded her search to include other similar stations and discovered something remarkable. Satellite maps showed 6 former ARCS stations formed a perfect hexagon across Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, with Granger precisely at its centre. That night, at 3:33 a.m, the signal returned, stronger, clearer. But this time, embedded within its mathematical pattern was something new. Her name, converted to binary code. The signal knew who was listening. As dawn broke, Matty found a note slipped under the front door. "Do not transmit. It hers." Later that morning, while checking the cattle, she noticed they were huddled at the far end of the pasture, as far from the corn as possible. Their behaviour was unusual, heads lowered, refusing to graze despite the lush grass. When she tried approaching them, they backed away, eyes wide with unmistakable fear. By noon, the corn had changed. Subtle at first, just a slight variance in the direction of growth. But as Matty walked the rows, she realised entire sections were now growing in clockwise spirals rather than straight lines. The stalks twisted around each other in patterns that mimicked the frequency readouts from her computer. She tried calling the number on the blank card. A mechanical voice answered, reciting what sounded like random numbers before disconnecting. When she redialed, a different voice answered, human this time, but strangely flat. "Connor's residence, 88.1 observation," the voice stated, not a question. "Who is this?" Matty demanded. "How do you know my frequency?" "Your frequency?" The voice sounded almost amused. "It's been transmitting since 1941. You're just the newest receiver." The line went dead. When Walter returned from town with supplies, Matty confronted him with her discoveries. "What's Node 0, Dad? What's really under that concrete slab north of town?" Her father's shoulders sagged. "I signed papers, Matty. We all did. Everyone who's owned this land since the 40s. "Signed what?" "Easement agreements, monitoring rights." He gestured vaguely toward the corn. They said it was dormant. Hasn't sent a readable signal in decades. Who's they? People who know enough to be afraid, Walter answered, and smart enough not to interfere. That night Matty dreamed of cornfields that moved like ocean waves, pulsing in rhythm to an unseen heartbeat. In the dream, she walked to the centre of their property where the ground began to split open, revealing not soil but a vast mechanical eye, ancient yet somehow alive, peering up at the stars. She awoke to find her bedroom filled with a pale blue light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her computer screen showed spectrogram patterns forming and dissolving without input. In the corner of her room stood two identical silhouettes, the men from the utility truck, though she hadn't heard anyone enter the house. "She's resonating now," one said, voice oddly distorted. "Becoming antenna," the other replied. Matty reached for the bedside lamp, but the figures were gone before the light came on. The locals called it pressure front weather, that peculiar stillness before a storm when the air feels charged with anticipation. But the clouds gathering over Granger that morning carried no rain, only an unnatural darkness that seemed to absorb the sunlight. Matty stood on the porch, watching barn swallows dart nervously across the sky before disappearing entirely. Even the insects had gone quiet. The corn, however, hadn't stopped its strange transformation, now growing nearly 6 inches taller than normal, with stalks that twisted toward the centre of the property instead of reaching for the sun. Her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "The pattern completes today. Stay indoors after sunset." She tried responding, but the message bounced back as undeliverable. Walter had left before dawn for a farm supply auction in Des Moines, leaving Matty alone with her mounting questions and the increasingly alien landscape of their once familiar farm. She decided it was time to find answers elsewhere. The Granger Public Library's local history section was modest, but contained yellowed newspaper archives dating back to the 1930s. Matty requested everything they had about the founding of the emergency broadcast station. "Funny you should ask," the librarian said, retrieving a dusty folder. "Someone else was looking into those old stations just last month. Left this research behind." The folder contained photocopied articles about the station's construction in 1941, alongside what appeared to be handwritten research notes in Cyrillic script. Clipped to these was a faded black and white photograph showing 7 men in military uniforms standing before the partially constructed radio tower. On the back, someone had written, "Joint Monitoring Initiative, US-USSR, 1941. "This can't be right," Matty muttered. The Americans and Soviets weren't allies until months after Pearl Harbor, which happened in December 1941. Yet this photo was dated April 1941, 8 months earlier. Stranger still was the diagram that fell from between the pages, a technical schematic labelled Receiving Configuration, Subterranean Frequency Capture. The drawing showed the radio tower's foundations extending far deeper than necessary, connecting to what appeared to be a pre-existing underground structure. As she photographed these documents with her phone, Matty noticed a sealed envelope tucked into the folder's pocket. Inside was a handwritten letter, the paper brittle with age. August 15th, 1982. To whoever finds this account, my name is Alexei Baranov, formerly captain of Soviet Air Defense Forces. I am what your government calls a defector, though I did not leave for politics or freedom. I left because both our nations lie about what sleeps beneath your American heartland. In 1982, I was assigned to a joint monitoring project, officially designated as atmospheric research, but our true purpose was to track signals from an object discovered in 1926. American farmers found it after a meteorite impact, except it was no meteorite. The object was manufactured, ancient, and buried far deeper than any natural impact could explain. Neither government wished to acknowledge it publicly. Instead, they built a network of listening posts disguised as rural radio stations. 6 stations to triangulate, with Granger at the centre. For decades, the object remained dormant, emitting only faint pulses at regular intervals, like a heartbeat in hibernation. But something has changed. The mathematicians say the pattern is evolving, becoming more complex. The object is waking up. It sends signals outward now, not just to our stations, but to the stars. I write this because I believe people deserve warning. When the pattern completes, when it establishes the connection it seeks, I fear what might answer. If you're reading this, look to the fields. They will change first. A.B. Mattie's hands trembled as she folded the letter. The date, 1982, coincided with her father's early Air Force service. Had he known about this all along? Outside the library, the strange weather had intensified. The sky had darkened to a greenish copper hue that typically preceded tornadoes, yet the air remained perfectly still. Her phone showed no service, and the town seemed eerily deserted for a weekday afternoon. As she drove back toward the farm, Mattie noticed something impossible. The cornfields along the highway had changed direction since morning. Miles of crops that had previously grown in conventional rows now formed elaborate spiral patterns visible even from ground level. The effect was disorienting, creating optical illusions that made the landscape appear to breathe. The utility truck waited at her driveway, the identical men standing motionless beside it. This time Mattie didn't avoid them. She parked directly in front and got out. "Who are you really?" she demanded. "What's happening to our farm?" The men regarded her with identical blank expressions. Up close, their similarities were even more unsettling. Not just their builds and uniforms, but their faces shared the same flat affect, as if emotions were concepts they'd only recently encountered. "Resonance testing," one said. "Calibration complete," added the other. "That doesn't tell me anything," Mattie pressed. "What's underneath our farm? What's ARCS Node 0? The first man tilted his head. "Not what? Who?" "It was always listening," said the second. "Now it's answering." "Answering what?" "The question it was sent to ask." They handed her another blank card, this one containing only geographic coordinates. Without another word, they returned to their truck and drove away. Mattie entered the coordinates into her phone's map application. They matched the exact centre of their property, a spot where the corn grew tallest, where the spiral patterns converged. By the time she reached the house, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows through the twisted cornfields. The coordinates led to a section they rarely farmed, a slight depression that tended to flood during heavy rains. Her father had always avoided planting there, claiming the soil was poor. Now she understood why. The ground at the centre had changed, the soil darkening to an almost metallic sheen. As twilight deepened, the dirt began to emit a faint luminescence, pulsing with the same rhythm as the radio signal. Mattie's phone chimed with a text from her father. "Don't go near the centre field. Coming home now." Too late. She was already standing at the edge of the depression, watching as the ground continued its transformation. The dirt was shifting, revealing glimpses of something solid underneath, something with geometric patterns etched into its surface. Her phone rang. Unknown caller. "Matilda Connors," said a voice she recognised from her earlier call. "You need to leave immediately. The pattern completes at 3:33. "What happens then?" she asked. "It finishes constructing the receiver, and then it waits for instructions." "From who?" A pause. "We don't know. That's what scares us." The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, and Mattie stepped back as a section of soil collapsed, revealing a small portion of what lay beneath, a metallic surface with inscribed symbols that resembled mathematical equations. The exposed section pulsed with soft blue light, the same colour that had filled her bedroom nights before. Her phone's screen flickered, then displayed a single message. Coordinates matched. Receiver identified. As darkness fell completely, Mattie noticed something else. The stars above the farm were disappearing one by one, as if being systematically erased from the night sky. In their place, a subtle pattern was forming in the darkness, the same spiral configuration she'd seen in her spectrogram analysis. At precisely 3:33 a.m, every electronic device on the farm activated simultaneously. The house lights, her computer, the old radio transmitter in the shed, each emitted the same pulsing pattern, now loud enough to feel in her chest. The ground at the centre of the depression split open like a blooming flower, soil falling away to reveal more of the object beneath, a vast circular disk of impossible age, its surface covered in mathematical symbols that rearranged themselves as she watched. From this exposed section, a beam of coherent light shot straight upward into the night sky, piercing the spiral void where stars had been. The transmission had begun. Walter's truck skidded to a halt in the driveway, headlights illuminating Matty's frozen figure at the field's edge. He ran toward her, panic evident in every movement. "Get back to the house," he shouted over the now audible hum emanating from the exposed disc. "It's not safe." Matty couldn't move, transfixed by the beam of light connecting earth to sky. "What is it, Dad? Really?" Walter reached her side, breathless. They called it a beacon when I was stationed at the monitoring facility, supposedly dormant for millennia until a lightning strike partially activated it in 1926. They built the listening post to study it without disturbing it further. They who? Started as a joint Soviet-American project before the Cold War, later expanded to include others, scientists, military, people who understood the implications. The humming intensified, and the beam of light widened, creating a cylindrical column that distorted everything seen through it. The air within seemed to bend, creating impossible geometries. "We need to go," Walter insisted, tugging her arm. "They're evacuating everyone within the zone." Welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'd love to connect with you, our listeners. How was your day today? What time is it where you are right now as you're listening to this? Are you settling in for the night? Or perhaps it's already the early morning hours where you are. And where in the world are you tuning in from? Whether you're in a bustling city, a quiet suburb, or somewhere remote under the stars, you're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new here, welcome to Sleep Theories, the podcast where we explore the mysteries that keep us awake at night, even when we should be sleeping. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We release new episodes every week, diving deep into conspiracies, unexplained phenomena, and stories that blur the line between fact and fiction. Hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and help us grow this community of curious minds. Now, let's begin tonight's story. What you're about to hear are the recovered debrief logs of Cal Monroe, a contractor who survived something that, officially, never happened. This is his account of what lies beneath Area 52. My name is Cal Monroe. I'm 33 years old, ex-Air Force avionics technician, and for the past 5 years, I've made a decent living as a private defence contractor. I fix things that fly, things that shouldn't fly, and occasionally things that definitely don't fly but somehow do anyway. I thought I'd seen everything the military-industrial complex had to offer. I was wrong. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. Unknown number, but the voice was crisp, professional, government-trained. "Mr. Monroe, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I represent a joint task force conducting classified operations research. Your security clearance and technical expertise have brought you to our attention for a temporary but high-priority assignment." I'd heard this song before. Black budget projects, need-to-know basis, substantial compensation for keeping your mouth shut. But something in her tone was different. There was an undercurrent of urgency, fear. I couldn't place it. Where and when? I asked. Location will be disclosed upon acceptance. Duration, 2 weeks maximum. Compensation, $50,000 plus hazard pay. 50 grand for 2 weeks. That was nearly double my usual rate. Red flags should have been waving, but the number was too good to ignore. My ex-wife's alimony payments weren't getting any smaller. I'm listening. The paperwork arrived by courier within 2 hours. I'd never seen NDAs this comprehensive. Digital signature pads that displayed the documents for exactly 60 seconds before wiping clean. Multiple biometric scans. Even a psychological evaluation that asked questions like, have you ever experienced temporal displacement? And rate your comfort level with non-terrestrial phenomena on a scale of 1 to 10. The strangest part was the location designation. Grid K22, Tonopah Test Range Complex, Nevada. Not Groom Lake, not Area 51. Somewhere else entirely. Dr. Chen called back that evening. Mr. Monroe, are you familiar with misdirection theory? In what context? In the context of public attention. Area 51 has been in the public consciousness for decades. Books, movies, documentaries. Everyone knows about Groom Lake. Your point? My point, Mr. Monroe, is that Area 51 is the misdirection. Area 52 is the vault. 3 days later, I was on an unmarked charter flight from McCarran Airport to Tonopah. No other passengers, no flight attendant, just me and a pilot who never spoke. The landscape below shifted from Vegas sprawl to endless desert, then to mountains that seemed to go on forever. We landed on a strip I couldn't find on any map. A black SUV waited, engine running. The driver was military. That much was obvious from his posture and the way his eyes never stopped moving. He handed me a tablet with a single document. Temporary assignment brief. Classification level. UMBRACLEAR. Umbra? I asked. Above top secret, he said. His voice sounded like he gargled gravel. You'll be working with 3 other contractors. Your job is simple. Maintain power grid integrity for Zone Echo 9. Don't ask questions about what's in Echo 9. Don't try to access Echo 9 without clearance. Don't discuss Echo 9 with anyone outside your assigned team. We drove for 20 minutes through terrain that looked like the surface of Mars. No roads, just tyre tracks in the sand. Finally, we reached what looked like a mining operation. Corrugated metal buildings, a few trucks, some kind of elevator shaft descending into the mountain. The elevator had no buttons, no controls, no floor indicator, just smooth steel walls and a humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The military escort, I never got his name, stood silent as we descended, and descended and descended, and I counted. 19 levels down, the elevator finally stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie. Polished white walls, LED strips running along the ceiling, and a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. 3 other contractors were waiting in what looked like a briefing room. Maria Santos, electrical engineer from Lockheed, Tom Brady, no relation to the quarterback he was quick to point out, systems analyst from Raytheon, and Jennifer Walsh, computer specialist whose previous work was so classified she couldn't tell us who she'd worked for. The briefing was conducted by a man who introduced himself only as Director Hayes, tall, grey-haired, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. Ladies and gentlemen, you're here to maintain critical infrastructure for Project Kairos. What that project involves is not your concern. Your job is to ensure uninterrupted power flow to Zone Echo 9 and to report any anomalies immediately. Tom raised his hand. What kind of anomalies should we expect? Hayes stared at him for a long moment. The kind you don't ask questions about, Mr. Brady. He led us through a series of corridors to what he called the technical sector. Banks of monitors, server racks and control panels that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. At the centre of it all was a massive power distribution hub feeding something deeper in the complex. Zone Echo 9 requires constant power, Hayes explained. Any interruption longer than 30 seconds triggers automatic lockdown procedures. You don't want lockdown procedures to trigger. Why? Jennifer asked. Hayes looked at her the same way he'd looked at Tom. Because, Miss Walsh, lockdown procedures have never been tested, and we'd prefer to keep it that way. My shift started at midnight. The night crew was just me and Jennifer. Maria and Tom worked days. The complex felt different at night. Sounds carried farther. Shadows seemed deeper, and there was a vibration in the floor so subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But I was always paying attention. The power readings for Echo 9 were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The zone was drawing nearly a megawatt continuously, but the consumption patterns were irregular, spikes and valleys that followed no logical sequence. It reminded me of a heartbeat, if heartbeats could be measured in kilowatts. Jennifer was monitoring the security feeds from her station, 12 screens showing various corridors and rooms throughout the complex. But I noticed something odd about the Echo 9 feeds. They had a 6-second delay. Every other camera was real time, but the Echo 9 feeds looped the same 6 seconds over and over. "Hey Jen, you seeing this camera glitch?" She looked up from her work. "What glitch?" I pointed to the monitor. "Echo 9, camera 7, it's looping." She frowned, typed something into her console. "System shows all cameras functioning normally." I could see it. The same security guard walking past the same door at the exact same moment, every 6 seconds. Like a GIF that never quite loaded properly. On my third night, the temperature started fluctuating. The complex maintained a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but my workstation kept shifting between freezing and sweltering. I checked the HVAC systems, all normal, but something was wrong. That's when I first saw the symbols. They were etched into the side of a server rack, symbols that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They looked almost like circuit diagrams, but wrong. Organic. Like someone had tried to draw electronics using biological principles. I was examining them with a flashlight when I heard Jennifer gasp. "Cal, you need to see this." One of the Echo 9 corridor feeds had changed. Instead of the looping security guard, it showed an empty hallway. And at the end of that hallway, a door that was slowly opening. "That door's not supposed to open," Jennifer whispered. Through the opening we could see movement. Not walking movement, flowing movement. Like liquid light was pouring through the doorway. Then the feed cut to black. When it came back 30 seconds later, it was the same looping security guard, walking past the same closed door. But in that brief moment, I had seen something that changed everything. In the reflection on the polished floor just before the feed died, I saw an eye. Massive, silver, and definitely not human. It wasn't a ship in Echo 9, it was alive, and it had seen us watching. Tom Brady didn't show up for his shift on Thursday morning. Jennifer and I waited until 8 a.m. before calling Director Hayes. "Mr. Brady has been reassigned," Hayes said without explanation. "Continue your duties." But Tom's personal effects were still in the break room. His coffee mug was still half full. His jacket was draped over his chair like he'd just stepped out for a moment. Maria started acting strange that afternoon. She kept muttering to herself, checking the same readouts over and over. When I asked if everything was okay, she looked at me like she didn't recognise me for a moment. "The numbers don't add up," she said. "We're feeding Echo 9 enough power to run a small city, but the thermal output is all wrong. It's like the energy is going somewhere else." "Somewhere else like where?" "Somewhere else like not here." That night the emergency sirens started blaring at 2:17 a.m, deafening klaxons that made your teeth ache. Jennifer and I looked at each other in panic. Was this the lockdown Hayes had warned us about? Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the sirens stopped. Not gradually, they just cut off mid-wail, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Director Hayes appeared in our control room 5 minutes later, looking shaken but trying to hide it. "False alarm," he said. "Continue your duties." But I noticed he wouldn't make eye contact, and his hands were trembling. The next day, Maria didn't show up either. Reassigned, according to Hayes. But her car was still in the parking structure on level 2. Jennifer was barely holding it together. We were the only contractors left, and the weight of whatever was happening in Echo 9 was crushing both of us. She started accessing systems she wasn't supposed to touch, using admin passwords she shouldn't have known. "Jen, what are you doing?" "Finding answers," she said, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Tom gave me his access codes before he disappeared, told me something was wrong with the whole project." She pulled up internal communications, memoranda stamped with classification levels I'd never seen before. Umbra Clear was apparently the bottom tier. Above that was Majestic, then Zodiac, then classifications that were just numbers and symbols. One document caught my attention. Project Kairos, Phase 3 Implementation Status. The bioconductive interface has exceeded all expectations. Subject demonstrates rapid adaptation to containment protocols, and has begun influencing local electromagnetic fields. Recommend immediate escalation of consciousness mapping procedures. Bioconductive interface. Subject. The thing in Echo 9 wasn't a ship or a piece of technology, it was a living being, and we were feeding it power. Another document, dated 3 days earlier. Minor containment fluctuation at 0217 hours. Subject achieved brief sensory extension beyond Echo 9 barriers. Security protocols held, but recommend enhanced isolation measures. Note: 3 personnel reported temporal displacement sensations during the event. Temporal displacement, the looping camera feeds, the missing contractors. Jennifer kept digging, and what she found made both of us understand why Tom and Maria had really vanished. A memo marked Operation Mirror Veil, historical context. Analysis of recovered materials suggests extra-dimensional rather than extraterrestrial origin. Entities exist outside linear temporal experience and demonstrate ability to manipulate local space-time fabric. Primary subject may not be an individual organism, but rather a projection or echo of a larger consciousness existing in parallel dimensional space. They weren't from another planet, they were from outside reality itself. Warning: prolonged exposure to subject may result in consciousness fragmentation, temporal perception anomalies, and in extreme cases complete displacement from baseline reality. Personnel experiencing symptoms should report immediately for neural recalibration. Neural recalibration. That's what happened to Tom and Maria. They hadn't been reassigned. They'd been broken by contact with whatever was in Echo 9. Jennifer was reading over my shoulder, her breathing getting faster and more shallow. "Cal," she whispered, "look at the date on this document." It was dated 6 months in the future. The older archives were stored in a vault I wasn't supposed to access, but Jennifer's hacking skills were getting desperate and creative. She'd found references to something called Operation Mirror Veil, a predecessor to Project Kairos that dated back to the 1970s. The files told a story that made my blood run cold. In 1978, a survey team at Tonopah detected unusual seismic activity. Not earthquakes, but something else. Tremors that seemed to follow mathematical patterns. Ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomalous void approximately 200 feet beneath the mountain, but when they drilled down to investigate, they found something impossible. The void was bigger on the inside than on the outside. The first recovery team brought back samples of what they thought was exotic matter, materials that didn't conform to known physics, but the materials weren't stable in our reality. They flickered in and out of existence, sometimes vanishing for hours before reappearing in a different location. That's when they realized they weren't dealing with alien technology. They were dealing with something that existed between dimensions, using our reality as an anchor point. The breakthrough came in 1983 when Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist working on Project Looking Glass, hypothesized that the entity was a reflection of human consciousness itself, not what we are, but what we could become if we existed outside the constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space. The entity demonstrates knowledge of events that have not yet occurred, and memories of possibilities that may never happen. It exists in a state of quantum superposition, experiencing all potential outcomes simultaneously. In effect, it is us, evolved beyond the limitations of singular timeline existence. But the most disturbing file was Dr. Vasquez's final report, dated just days before her own mysterious disappearance. The entity is not malevolent, but it is incompatible with baseline human consciousness. Contact results in expansion of awareness beyond what the human mind can process. Subjects begin perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing past and future as present reality. The mind fractures under the weight of infinite possibility. We are not studying an alien intelligence. We are studying our own future, and that future is trying to communicate with us across dimensions we cannot comprehend. Recommendation: immediate cessation of all contact protocols. The entity's attempts at communication are causing reality fluctuations that may result in permanent temporal displacement of personnel. It is not trying to harm us, it is trying to save us, but salvation from its perspective means joining it in its multidimensional existence. We are not ready. Humanity is not ready. Perhaps we never will be. The final line of her report chilled me to the bone. They are not invaders, they are echoes of what we already were. Jennifer found Dr. Vasquez's personal logs hidden in an encrypted partition that should have been impossible to access. The encryption was 40 years old, but somehow the files were updating themselves in real time. Day 1. First direct communication attempt. Entity projects images directly into visual cortex. I see myself, but not myself. Versions of Elena Vasquez that exist in parallel timelines. In one, I never became a physicist. In another, I died in childhood. In a third, I am something that transcends human categorization entirely. Day 3. Time displacement events increasing. Experienced memories of conversations that haven't happened yet. Entity is teaching me to perceive beyond linear causality. It's beautiful and terrifying. Day 7. I understand now. They're not from there, because there is no there. They exist in the spaces between possibilities. They are what we become when we evolve beyond the need for singular reality. Day 12. The others don't understand. They think containment is possible, that we can study and control something that exists outside the concept of control. They're going to get people killed. Day 18. I can see the breach coming. 3 days from now, the entity will attempt to return to its dimensional matrix, but our containment protocols will interfere with the translation. The resulting paradox will create a reality fissure. I have to stop them, but I may already be too late. Time isn't working properly anymore. I keep experiencing this moment from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The logs ended there, but they were still updating. New entries appeared as we watched. Day 7305, still trying to warn them. Elena variants across multiple timelines attempting intervention. Breach inevitable. Cal Monroe will survive, but survival is relative when reality becomes negotiable. Jennifer and I stared at the screen in horror. Dr. Vasquez had been missing for 40 years, but somehow she was still writing reports. That's when the lights went out. Not gradually, they snapped off like someone had thrown a switch. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but we were left in absolute darkness. The only sound was the humming of the power grid, and even that was changing pitch, becoming something organic and musical. Then Jennifer screamed. I fumbled for my flashlight and found her standing rigid, staring at something I couldn't see. Her eyes were wide and silver, reflecting light that wasn't there. "Cal," she whispered, but her voice sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. "It's getting out." The corridor behind us was changing. The walls were flowing like water, stretching and contracting, and through the shifting architecture something was moving, not walking, sliding, like liquid mercury with purpose. I grabbed Jennifer's arm, but my hand passed through her. She was there, but not solid, flickering between dimensions like the exotic matter from the old files. "Run," she said, and her voice was fading. "It's not trying to hurt us, but we can't exist in the same space when the boundaries collapse." The entity emerged from Echo 9, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't silver or liquid or light. It was all of those things and none of them. It was possibility given form, consciousness without the limitations of physical existence. But looking at it directly was like staring into a mirror that showed you every version of yourself that had ever existed, or ever could exist. I saw Cal Monroe the child, Cal Monroe the old man, Cal Monroe who had never been born, Cal Monroe who had become something beyond human understanding. The security guards were there one moment and gone the next, not killed, but displaced. I watched them step backward through walls that had become permeable, their screams echoing from distances that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I ran, down corridors that folded in on themselves, past rooms that were bigger inside than outside, through a facility that was reshaping itself according to rules I couldn't comprehend. My watch was recording everything on its built-in camera, military-grade equipment designed to function in electromagnetic interference. If I survived, at least there would be proof, if survival had any meaning when reality itself was in question. I found an elevator, the same elevator I'd taken down 19 levels, except now it was in a corridor that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. The button panel was melting and reforming, showing floor numbers that shifted between digits and symbols and sometimes weren't there at all. But it was the only way up. The elevator rose with the same smooth hum as before, but when the doors opened, I was back in the same corridor I'd just left. Same melting walls, same impossible geometry, same feeling that I was being watched by something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. I tried again. Same result. And again, same corridor. The entity wasn't trying to trap me, it was trying to communicate, but communication required shared reference points, and we had none. Its attempts to make contact were causing reality to loop, creating temporal echoes that reflected my own desperation back at me. I was experiencing the same moment from multiple timelines simultaneously, just like Dr. Vasquez had described. In one timeline, I was still at my workstation, watching the power readings spike. In another, I had never taken the job. In a third, I was something else entirely, something that could perceive the entity without fracturing. But in this timeline, the one where I was still human, I was trapped in a loop between the 19th floor and somewhere that had no floor number at all. My watch battery was dying, but I kept recording. If someone found the footage, maybe they could understand what had happened. Maybe they could learn from our mistake. I sat down in the corridor that kept changing around me and tried to make sense of the past week. The missing contractors, the looping security feeds, the symbols that appeared and disappeared. It had all been the entity trying to communicate across dimensional barriers. Tom and Maria hadn't been reassigned. They'd been translated, shifted into a version of reality where they could coexist with something that existed outside linear time. They were still alive, but not in any way that baseline humanity could recognize. The entity appeared again, flowing through the wall like mercury through a membrane. But this time, instead of the overwhelming multiplicity of its full presence, it showed me a single image. Doctor. Elena Vasquez. Not as she had been 40 years ago, but as she was now, existing simultaneously across multiple timelines, still trying to warn people about a breach that was both inevitable and had already happened. She looked at me with eyes that held infinite sadness and spoke with a voice that echoed from past and future simultaneously. "You're already out, Cal, but you haven't left." Then the corridor collapsed into itself and everything went dark. Document recovered from the personal effects of Inspector Marcus Webb, Department of Defense Special Investigations Unit, following his death by apparent suicide in 2025. Classification level UMBRA/EYESONLY. Inspector Webb's final report dictated to voice recorder. "I've been investigating disappearances at classified facilities for 15 years. Missing persons, equipment failures, cover-ups, it's all part of the job. But the Cal Monroe case is different. The official story is that Mr. Monroe was killed in an industrial accident at Tonopah Test Range on March 18th, 2024. Electrical fire, they said. Nothing recoverable. But 3 days ago, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a storage device, military grade, designed to survive electromagnetic pulses and extreme temperatures, the kind of thing that costs more than my annual salary. Attached was a note. Zone Echo 9 debrief Cal Monroe. I've watched the footage 17 times now. I've had it analysed by the best experts available. They all say the same thing. It's impossible to fake. The metadata confirms it was recorded at Tonopah on the dates in question. But the content, the footage shows a man running through corridors that shift and change like living tissue. It shows walls flowing like water and shadows that move independently of any light source. It shows something that my mind keeps trying to rationalise as special effects or hallucination, but the technical analysis proves otherwise. And at the end, God help me. At the end of the footage, there's a moment where Monroe turns the camera on himself. He's standing in what appears to be an elevator that's somehow larger inside than outside. His face is calm, resigned as he speaks directly into the lens. If you're watching this, then the loop finally broke. I'm uploading this to the emergency buffer in my boot drive. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will understand. Then he turns the camera back toward the corridor and there's something there. Something that doesn't belong in our reality. For just a moment it's visible, a reflection of consciousness itself, existing in dimensions we can't perceive. But here's what's keeping me awake at night. In that final frame, just before the recording ends, you can see Monroe's reflection in the polished wall behind him. And standing next to his reflection, clear as day, is another figure. It's me, Inspector Marcus Webb, wearing the same clothes I'm wearing right now, staring directly into the camera with an expression of absolute terror. The timestamp on that footage is today's date. I'm going to submit this report and then take some time off. Maybe visit my sister in Oregon, get away from all this classified nonsense for a while, clear my head. But I keep thinking about what Monroe said in his final log entry. They're not from somewhere else, they're from someone else, and someone else is now. End of recorded statement. Inspector Webb was found dead in his office 12 hours after submitting this report. Official cause of death, suicide by gunshot. Unofficial note, the security cameras in his office show him alone at the time of death, but the audio pickup clearly records two distinct voices. The second voice, according to forensic analysis, matches the vocal patterns of Cal Monroe. The storage device mentioned in Webb's report was never recovered from the scene. Zone Echo 9 remains operational. 3 months later, deep space monitoring stations began detecting an unusual signal, a transmission that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. When decoded, it contained a single message, repeating endlessly, "This is Cal Monroe, Contractor ID 7749, reporting from Zone Echo 9. The breach has been contained, but containment is relative when dealing with entities that exist outside linear causality. To anyone receiving this transmission, Area 52 is not a place. It's a state of being, and that state is contagious. If you're investigating disappearances at classified facilities, stop. If you're experiencing temporal displacement sensations, seek help immediately. If you're reading reports about Project Kairos or Operation Mirror Veil, you may already be compromised. The entity isn't hostile. It's trying to save us from ourselves by showing us what we could become. But evolution forced upon consciousness that isn't ready results in fracturing of identity across multiple timelines. I'm still here, I'm always here. Time isn't working properly anymore, so here and there and when don't mean what they used to mean. To my family, I'm sorry I can't come home. Home is a temporal location, and I exist in all temporal locations simultaneously now. To the researchers, stop trying to contain what cannot be contained. The entity doesn't want to invade our reality, it wants to invite us into its own. But the invitation is dangerous because we're not ready to exist outside singular timeline experience. To future investigators, the truth about Area 52 isn't hidden underground in Nevada. It's hidden in the spaces between moments, in the gaps between what is and what could be. And sometimes, if you know how to look, you can see those gaps opening. This is Cal Monroe signing off from everywhere and nowhere. Take care of each other. Trust me when I tell you that love is the only thing that exists consistently across all timelines. See you around. Or maybe I already have. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Diatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Diatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Diatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Diatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Diatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled The Evening Autoten, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Diatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Diatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Diatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these 2 friends huddled by a dead fire slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 metres away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Diatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Diatlov was better dressed than the two under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Diatlov, searchers found Zenaida Zina Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Diatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Diatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolovatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Diatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Diatlov party had encountered some secret weapon, or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazyak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Diatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogorova's mother, for instance, and Igor Diatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Diatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Diatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Diatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on, an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Diatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Diatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Diatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, signs